This video is sponsored by Alpha Draft, where you can play fantasy esports such as CSGO, League of Legends. They have the League of Legends World Championship going on right now that you'll be able to play. Presumably the next Dota 2 major. Now, in esports, as someone who's done many interviews, so I've talked to lots of players about how they see themselves, how they conceive of the game, how they think of opponents that they play, and the way they describe them. One of the problems I've noticed is that there's certain terms that are used in a household manner every day in and day out, to describe players that are just far too simplistic, or they're not well defined, let's put it that way. And as a result, people say these things thinking that their internal dictionary matches up with everyone else's internal dictionary, and that they're giving an accurate description of someone, whereas really they're saying very little, and they're just leaving this massive wide gap for other people to draw strange conclusions, or to think they mean something else than they actually do, which is kind of to fail to get to the point of what you were supposed to be doing with languages, which is to be able to communicate what you're thinking and express your thoughts with some kind of depth or quality of thought to it, that when the other person receives the information, they at least to some degree can conceive of what you meant by it. So these terms, aggression and passivity, I mean, they usually refer to just as this person's aggressive, this person's passive. When we use these simple terms to label and describe players, the problem is they are just too vague, and they don't do a very good job of really describing like what it is that the player's doing or how he's doing it. It's just such a broad umbrella term that we just use and then put that label on him and go, right, that's it, no problem, aggressive. But it doesn't really explain to us, is that a positive connotation to what you're saying there? How do they express that like aggression or passivity in their play? And so in the end, these words just end up being labels, terms that act as containers for more complicated criteria of thought, or adjectives that would be better used to describe the person if you made them sit down and break down in detail what they really mean by that. And because if you don't do that, I think that these terms have got very different meanings for different people. So I want to discuss that in this video and get to some of what I think is some of the terms we can use that'll fix the problem, basically bridge the gaps that I see in how these terms are used. So first of all, there's the issue that when these terms are used, a lot of people, you can tell by the way they talk about aggressive play or passive play, that they have a natural bias, or they have a tendency themselves towards preferring one of them or playing in one of those styles. And so they'll tend to have a natural bias for one of them and against the other. And that'll sometimes mean that they act as though aggressive play is positive, it's a good thing, it's the way you should play. Passive play is weak and it's not the way you should play, and it's to someone who it's not able to play the game and it's not confident in themselves. They'll make all these associations like confidence with aggressive play, like weak-willed nature, scared, cowardice, not willing to make the play, not able to step up, not brave, these sorts of things with the passive play. So we can already see from the way they're talking, actually, if we look at the other terms, kind of what they're trying to get to, but they're not doing a very good job of even explaining that outright. It's just naturally there in the background, latent to some degree. So I understand when you talk about this, and people don't break it down in this manner, but what I think you should do first and foremost is break down that these terms are not like it's not binary thinking. It's not like you're either aggressive or you're passive. And it's not like if you're aggressive, that's good, and if you're passive, that's bad. There's not only these two positions you can be in. It's more like a wide spectrum like this. And at the very end, there's the most passive player possible. And at the very other end, there's the most aggressive player possible. And in reality, there's a massive section between. Let's say the middle point is like someone who's neither, if that was possible, some sort of hybrid. And then even between the two, okay, you can be, it's not positive and negative. You can be aggressive, but in a way that's destructive and destroys your whole gameplay and gives you way less chance to win. You can be aggressive in a way that's incredible and makes plays and allows you to dominate the game in a way no one other maybe could in the aggressive category. Then there's passive side where you are indecisive and you're unable to play the game and you're just scared and you're letting the other person dictate what happens. And there's passive where you're just baiting in people who are making those overly aggressive moves that don't make sense, and you're just destroying them and punishing them for what's happening. So I think it's important that we look at these different aspects of the negative and the positive of each. Negative and positive of aggression, negative and positive of passivity, if you want to call it that. So the reason why I think there's naturally a bias among many players towards aggression, in terms of it being positive, is because of this notion that aggression is to force the action, whereas being passive is negative, because it's to let oneself be acted on by someone else. Like he's the one deciding what happens now, or he determines what the pace of the game will be, or he starts the engagement and he gets to choose when it all happens. And so naturally, I think just because a lot of people play games, they aren't very controlled, they aren't very calculated, they don't understand all the principles of the game. Naturally, their way to play the game is just to do things and to try and make things happen and to be aggressive and to learn from trial and error. So I think naturally people have a tendency towards this style of play. There are a lot of aggressive players out there. But each certainly has a negative and positive kind of example you could give, even within its own world of just aggression and just passivity. So I'll give some for different games. If we want to talk about negative passivity, then in League of Legends, there's a great example for you, which is a guy called Shifter, who was the mid laner. Primarily, people will know him as the mid laner of Team Coast or Dignitas. And when he was the player in both of these teams, when he was the mid laner of Coast, you could see from both his streaming and his LCS games, where sometimes he'd have a crazy game, skill level was pretty good. He was one of the rising stars, and he could have one day perhaps become a true star or a superstar level talent within North America. He had the skill set, he had the champion pool he could play. But what people thought was, when he was on this Coast team, they weren't a very good team. They were, in reality, they were like a 6th or 7th level team in LCS. So people used to think, right, it's just because he's on a bad team. He has to play safe, he has to rely on himself, he can't rely on teammates. That some of them aren't very good, the team concept isn't very good, the shot calling's not so good. So as a result, okay, it makes sense that he does that. But then he got into Dignitas, and it was a much better team, and at one point in time it was even number one very briefly for a couple of weeks. And it was a team where they had a bunch of other star level players and top talents, and he still played the same style. So what you saw there was, this was a guy where it was the negative side of passivity. He was unwilling to take any risks, which could have opened the game up and could have given his team chances to win games they wouldn't have won otherwise. But he wouldn't take them. He would sometimes just wait for the perfect opportunity to come. And if the perfect opportunity didn't come, he wouldn't have any impact on the game. He'd lose the game, have an okay scoreline, think, I didn't lose the game, and that would be it. Whereas, okay, yes, there's waiting for opportunities, but sometimes you have to look for, okay, there's not going to be an opportunity now. Now I have to make a play. Okay, I'm not going to take a crazy risk, but I'm going to make a play that's a calculated risk. It's going to make sense. That's something he wouldn't do as a player. Now, in CSGO terms, the player who most typifies this would be Device of 2013 and 2014. The star player, great rifler, great AWPer of Team Dignitas at the time, and now Team Solo Mid. Now he's become this phenomenal player, and this is something he mentioned on Twitter recently, where this is something, some advice that Devilwalk gave him, which is the idea that, like, you play to win. You don't play not to lose. Like, he was playing afraid before. In these big games, famously, everyone said he choked, and part of the reason why is you could tell from the way he played the game. Against lesser opponents and in group stages in less important matches, he would just play free, loose, the way he normally would online. He'd wreck people, he'd have phenomenal performances, crazy highlight kills, but when he got to the big semi-final, or the big game against the really top world-class team, he'd be playing way too safe than how he normally played, fitting his skill set. He'd be playing indecisive. He wouldn't take an aggressive move here. He'd just hope that the opponent made some weird mistake here that they probably weren't going to in terms of these sorts of games where it was the best teams he was playing against. And it seemed like he didn't want to be the player. Here's the key thing. He didn't want to be the player that lost his team the game. And so in doing so, he didn't make any of the plays that could lose the game, but actually indirectly, the ultimate irony is he obviously was the player losing his team the game because he was the star player and he wasn't playing star player impact on the game. He wasn't playing like the other star players that he was facing were, where they were dominating the game, they were having actions, they were taking the right sorts of plays for their skill set and their role to allow them to have a key impact on the game. So he was letting his team down. But he turned it around later, and now he's become a phenomenal player in terms of he still has a similar style, but now he's more open to how he does it, and it's more like it was outside of the big game, when he's in the big game now, and he consistently is very good now. Now, if you want to talk about the positive end of passivity, so a couple of League of Legends players that come to mind is Froggen and Nami. Now, Froggen in 2012, 2013, 2014, this is a guy who was a mid laner. Yes, he was always very passive in the lane, it seemed, if you want to use this term. He was someone who was never going to try and all in and go for a 1v1 kill. Instead, in fact, even when kills sometimes were available, if he could get the person low and he'd be like not as low but reasonably low, and to get the kill would involve like burning a flash, or it would involve going super balls deep under the other guy's tower. Sometimes he wouldn't do it in as much as he would just do a lot of damage to the other guy, have enough health himself to survive, push the guy off creeps so that he could get more creeps himself and get more gold as a result, which in the end of the day, if you get enough creeps, is worth kills. Or didn't want to burn the summoner so that then the enemy jungler didn't just come and gank him and then make it an even lane at that point. So instead, he'd just work smaller advantages. Likewise, Nami, this player was someone who he had at one point in time been an aggressive laner, but now in this EDG team, which is more of a late game centered team, he would play safer in the lane, he would try to get through the laning phase, he would pick smart matchups, and he would pick matchups towards the comp at the end of the game, because both of these players, part of the reason why they would take calculated risks in the laning phase is because they still could get edges, they still could do well, and once they got to the late game in the team fight, they were going to carry. These were monster players in the late game team fight. Very, very good. So to them, it didn't make sense to take these early game risks. They didn't need them. They didn't need to snowball in that sense because they were going to do the damage and win the game later. In terms of CS, a couple of great examples. In the modern day, Crims, because Crims is a player for Fnatic, support player, whose positioning is nearly always, in theory, passive, as in like he's waiting for the other person to come. He allows the opponent to choose when the engagement happens or choose the pace of the game. But what he does is he allows the opponent to make a mistake. He picks the best positioning. The opponent has a lesser positioning when he peeks in. Crims is now maximizing his skill set and his shots. He's getting more of them off. He's beating the opponents in certain situations. He's frustrating them. You can see what incredible impact he's had on his team. Likewise, old school get right. Yes, he played a style which for most other players would be baiting. It would be using up teammates to get a trade on there. It would be letting teammates die instead of quickly rotating back around this way so you could flank the other way and come behind the team. But he was so good at it. And his ability to read the game and make instead of making the one decision of when to go back in and help someone normally, he'd make the 10 really difficult, really nuanced decisions to allow him to win a crazy 1v3 or 1v4. And he was the best at it. He was the best player in the world, actually. Now, in terms of aggression, okay, so it's normally billed as something positive. Let's look at the negative sides of aggression. So in League of Legends, 2 players that immediately spring to mind, 2 AD carries. Wild Turtle, the AD carry of TSM, and Woolite, the former AD carry of Roccat, before that Denial Esports. Both of these players have infamous, really, it's so associated with their names now, that they will have times where they don't just go aggressively into a fight or take a fight or force an engagement. They will flash into it, go way too deep. Forget overextending, just going balls deep where unless they did some miracle play, they're definitely almost certainly going to ruin the whole situation and have their team a man down, if not maybe sometimes lead to the team getting wiped entirely because they've lost the DPS. They would do this so often that you could see it was a negative aspect. It was a negative expression of aggression. This wasn't good. They'd have been better off thinking more of a passive mindset at certain times in the game. Then you look in CSGO, a great example, because he's doing so well now, so like with Device where he's turned it around, was at Apex actually. Because in Titan, his sort of super ham aggression that he would have on T-side, okay, yes, it was really good when it worked. And when it worked well, it could be blisteringly excellent. But in Titan, when they lost Kaylee and now they didn't have enough fragging power, they needed someone to be doing some frags for them, but staying alive longer in the round. They couldn't have people like Maniac and RPK in existence be the ones in the clutch round every time. They weren't going to win games that way. Kenny was the major fragger in that sense. Apex needed to stay alive a bit more, so he needed to tone it down a bit, and he didn't. He still made those crazy, sometimes way over the top plays, and as a result, he would give entire games away sometimes, trying to force situations where the odds were so poor, it was never really going to work, and actually, he should have just looked for a better fight later, which had slightly higher odds, but revolved being a bit more patient. But that was never his style. He was so impulsive with how he did it. In terms of positive aggression, there's a lot of examples of this, but 2 great ones, because I'll pick 2 of the best of all time in their games. Faker in League of Legends. If he spots a little gap, he's so good at calculating whether or not it's possible to make this a good play from it, and he's so skilled that he is incredibly aggressive. He is the ultimate 1v1 player in League of Legends. The way he will just go in, burn everything, get the kill, get out on super low health. I mean, he's famous for it at this point in time. He's absolutely incredible, and that's why he strikes fear in the hearts of most other players he ever plays against in the mid lane. In CSGO, Olaf M. I mean, Olaf M has the skill set where if he wanted to, he could play a passive style, be very successful. But in his team doesn't have that many aggressive players. They have JW and that's it. Pronax is a very aggressive player because he's not that strong a fragger. Crims is a very defensive player. Very defensive, I meant for Pronax. Crims is a very defensive player because his positioning's excellent. He's a support player and he holds sights on his own, so he's used to having to not die. For him, the premium is on not dying and getting some kills, as opposed to getting more kills but dying and giving up the sight and all these map pressure, etc. And then in terms of Flusher, he's obviously a very passive player because he's the clutch round player, he's the lurker, he's the one who comes behind. He just holds sights himself in a very passive, off-the-man type way. So they needed more aggression than just JW's wildcard play. So Olaf M's the guy where he goes out there and he takes on the fights and he looks like Faker style for an opportunity. And then if he gets one, he goes in there and he has total confidence and he'll make those crazy 2 headshots that open a defense up and they get in there on the T side where traditionally they were a great CT side team. So we've seen there the positives and negatives of both aggression and passivity. There's clearly, it's not just one's good or one's bad. There's different aspects to it because it's a playing style at the end of the day. It's not linked to like you're a pussy or you're like so ballsy if you do this. No, sometimes you're an idiot if you go too aggressive in that sense or misapply aggression. And sometimes you are a coward if you go in that way. But sometimes when you go super passive, you're also being more intelligent in how you play the game. You're also playing the odds more. You're looking and calculating what's a better situation for yourself. So you can see that there is more of a spectrum here. You can see that the problem, as I've been breaking it down there, is the terminology, really. I mean, I alluded to this at the beginning in terms of how people think of it, and they think of it in such, as the just single words. They don't even attach that many associations overtly to it, but they do in their own minds, like, oh, he's a coward if he does that, oh, he's so aggressive, and that shows he's confident. Well, what we need to do now is actually have more terms, more descriptors, and we need to actually use those instead of just using aggression, passivity, or aggressive, or defensive, or passive. So, you can actually put part of it down to that as well. People think of aggression as attacking, and they think of passivity as defensive. Now, even those are loaded terms. So here we go. Let's expand our terms to solve this problem. And we'll get, in doing so, hopefully we can get a more depth of understanding, more quality of expression, really getting across what we're trying to mean about this person and where we describe them. So, okay, the term passivity, even though it has a negative connotation, in a way I don't mind if that stays, because if you actually do look up the dictionary definition, it does mean like to allow someone to act upon you, to react just to what someone does. It does have aspect of that. So I don't mind if we kept passivity, but just made that the negative term within that little spectrum of the not aggressive side of things. The passivity, we could keep that as the negative one. Could keep passivity if you want. Now the new term we would need for positive passivity, this is what I would choose, would be either patience, because that's what one of the defining qualities of it, looking for opportunities, but when you get them, you're willing to act on them. So it's not that you're indecisive. So actually, we can also say that. We can say that negative passivity is being indecisive, being too hesitant. Positive passivity, you're just calculating. You're looking for the smartest option. You're making key decisions before you take a play. That would be a great one for that. Something like patience or calculated reactive play. There's a good one. Now, I can understand the bias against that style of play because in a general trend, to make it work and to make it a positive, you have to have a higher in-game IQ because you have to allow your opponent to act, so he gets the element of surprise on you. Then you have to quickly assess the situation, know what possible things you can do here, know what he'll do next, react accordingly. And if you do so, you can totally outgame him. You can make him look like an absolute fool. He can blaze himself out. He can go into a move where you punish it utterly and force him back, and it looks like he made the mistake, but actually you capitalized on it and wrecked him as a result of it. You can totally frustrate certain types of players. This can be a very good style of play. Now then, negative aggression. What should we call that? I think negative aggression should be something, and we have some of these terms already, like overextending. There's a great one. You went for too much there. You overreached. Another great term, I think, would be just inefficient play. Inefficient attacking play, maybe. You're trying to be attacking, but you're doing it in such an inefficient way. It's not going to work very often. It's going to be detrimental overall to your team and to your individual game in general, probably. Now, I understand the natural bias towards aggression in this sense, because just like anyone who's played poker, there's a reason why early on you learn the basics by playing defensively. Then after that, you learn how to play attacking poker, because obviously then you can win hands without having a hand yourself, because you have the surprise factor. Someone doesn't know what you're doing here. They're worried, so they're indecisive. They don't make a decision. You made a decision. They never have to get to a showdown. You might win in that sense. There's also the factor that you can represent something very strong and intimidate a person and bully them off something that they might have had a 50-50 chance for. There's a lot of positives to this quality. And more importantly, by forcing opponents to react in a short space of time, it means that these sorts of opponents who don't have a very high in-game understanding and aren't great at making decisions, they're going to be flustered, and sometimes their choice will just be not to make a decision. Therefore, you will win some edge, and that's it. You'll get some sort of pressure. In poker, just pressure in the hand, force them off something. In the game, map pressure, they'll have to cede a position, or you just make them afraid to come back in a position. There's lots of positives to this. Likewise, there's the confirmation bias that when people make the crazy, to me, negative aggressive moves, but every now and then they'll still work, every now and then, very rarely, they'll make the crazy 4 headshots they have to and spinning 180, kill that guy who's going to kill them otherwise in better positioning. When that does happen, it seems so incredible because the ceiling on it seems really high, and they've made such a crazy play. Like, wow, that's better than whatever the passive guy could do. But the reason why it seems better is because the variance is much higher. It can also go way, way worse, and you can give a massive swing to the opponent of your death and a weapon, or like give up a buff or whatever it might be. Lose position on the map, you can give up so much. Whereas the more passive play, you're not going to have those huge swings to the same extent, but you're going to have more consistently higher ones if you're a good player and you've got the in-game IQ in that sense. So to me, now we have to go to what is positive aggression. Now, I don't mind aggression in general as a term because we do get a sense of that, but I think of positive aggression in terms of descriptors, adjectives, as like more being opportunistic or being decisive, seeing something, going for it. I realize that in itself is troublesome because I've used decisive already for positive passivity to a degree, but yeah, opportunistic I think is a good one there, where you're looking for opportunities, but when you get them, you seize them and you go on them. Now, in general, I think that another way you could use terms to change for these is you could call being negative in terms of passivity could be called indecisive, and being positive in terms of decisiveness could be called something like positive aggression. Well, let's say decisive. Yeah, there's another one we just did. Now, in sports, the reason why this is interesting is because I think it's a gaming problem where a lot of people have only played games or only think about the paradigm of games or conceptualize the game, but they don't link it to other sports. They're not taking a lot of the great terminology and understanding of styles of play from other sports. So in games like CS and League of Legends, a lot of people are limited to thinking that, good players will be aggressive, when really they just mean they'll be decisive. They won't be afraid to take moves. Likewise, they'll think that players who are too passive, they're scared and they haven't got confidence. But they'll sometimes, as a result, label the guy who's just calculated and who plays a defensive style, but that's because he's very shrewd in how he acts and he's waiting to make sure he has all the good situations to win from. He's not willing to gamble as much. Or maybe he has less skill, but he's very intelligent. He doesn't want to take those 50-50 chances where the guy who's super skilled thinks I can force that into a 60-40. There's different factors going on here. Because in other sports, I mean, a great example obviously is chess. I mean, I agree, some people might class that as a sport, maybe it's a competition. In that, you look at the greatest players of all time, world champions, and they're not all just aggressive attacking players. There are defensive players in there as well, calculated players who are so good at shutting down everything you do. The attacking player gets flustered, and what does he do at this point in time? And every little move he does, they take a little piece away from him, they just slowly choke him out like a boa constrictor. Meanwhile, there are the aggressive players who come in there and they wreck you, and they force you into bad decisions, and they're going on. But it's not that either is better. It's not that there's even a metagame where one's better. All depends who's playing who, what the current climate of the metagame's like, and then what decisions they're making. And usually what your natural strengths are and what you've worked on. So this is my style I've developed, therefore it's going to express itself in this way. So in other sports, it's understood that there are passive and aggressive styles. For some reason, I think probably because people are young and they haven't got so much experience with other sports sometimes, or they haven't thought of these concepts, they do assign positive and negative terms to aggression or passivity, but as if one is always this and one is always the other. You should always be heading towards the aggressive end. It is a spectrum. It's not binary thinking. Anyway, thanks to Alpha Draft for all the cash.